dear Mrs. Vice President, Carmen Gobi, distinguished guests, it is an honor for me to be here, and I'm very happy to seize this opportunity to talk about Africa and all the opportunities for the Austrian companies to invest in Africa. I would like to thank Mr. Michael Otter and Mrs. Astrid Fischel-Böhmer. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming to Côte d'Ivoire a few months ago, almost a year ago, and to try to create some synergies between Austrian companies and Côte d'Ivoire. Dear all, thank you for honoring Africa today with your presence. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Didier DROGBA, ex-football player, played for Marseille, Chelsea, Galatasaray, and I represented my country more than 105 times. Côte d'Ivoire, being African Player of the Year many times. I mean, now the career is over, so I can only speak about this in the past. But it is important for me as a person to succeed in my transition, and transitioning from a playing career to, let's call it a normal life is not always easy. But there's one thing that is really close to my heart, is the continent, the African continent, and it's an honor and also a big responsibility for me as an African, as an Ivorian, to talk about the continent and to make sure that Africa has been seen. Not, we talk about the Africa, not the Africa where you were talking about hunger, about wars. Africa is a land of opportunities for everyone. You know, to have such a career, I had to be fit. I needed to be fit in order to perform, and needed to build a strong and successful career. The reputation is important. To represent your country home on an international level is very, very demanding, very challenging. But when it comes to economics, I'm not an economist, actually. I'm just, like I said to you, an African, one of the ambassadors, for Africa, and I'm here to talk about investments and the opportunities, and to talk about the sustainable developments and cooperation matters on the continent, but all over the world. To be able to do that, I needed, first of all, something very important to me, the help of God, but also I needed, like I said, to be fit. It doesn't matter if you're injured, it doesn't matter if you fail, if you lose a game, or if you win, you always have to bounce back, to stand up and face challenges. And I see some similarities in the entrepreneurship and all the companies that are investing in Africa. It can be challenging sometimes, but you need to be patient, persistency, and courage, because it's not always easy. You know, even the most experienced companies, sophisticated companies, can be forced to recalibrate. I'm not going to name them, but we all know that it's been a big challenge for some of them. And deficits remains. What is important is that investors now realize there is money to be made for those who are bold enough, fit enough, to help and close the gap. As that takes place, the promise of greater prosperity for Africans and Africa business will be realized. The conversation about Africa is shifting from one of deficits and gaps to one of opportunities, prospects, venture, and creativity. And that's not new to companies that have paid close attention to the continent and invest there. One of the fast-growing youth population, the urbanization expected to drive over 50% of Africans to cities by 2050, and Africa's formalizing economy are all well known. And these trends and other developments have driven half of a century of more of growth in Africa and will continue to do so. The president of the Federation of German Industries, Mr. Siegfried Rosmuth, said, and I quote, "Africa is nowadays no longer just a continent of opportunity, but a must for German companies," for example. There's also Mr. Tidjane Thiam, former CEO of Swiss bank Credit Suisse, who said, "If you want to multiply your investment 100 times, go to Silicon Valley. But if you want it at 1,000 times, go to Africa." And I'm adding that Africa has seen a significant improvement in their economy of the last few decades. Despite being dubbed as one of the most underdeveloped nations, Africa presents a lot of resources and opportunities that entrepreneurs can tap into. 6 of 10 fast-growing economies in the world are African countries. With that, prominent businessmen, and business experts consider the continent as one of the most attractive investment destinations in the world. Indeed, is Africa the richest continent of the entire planet in terms of natural resources, landscape, fauna, pure nature, and more importantly, people, the culture, the young generations, and its propulsive dynamism. Let's now more or less take a closer look at Africa's competitiveness to measure its economic health in international comparison. In the 80s, the full year GDP growth in Africa was around 60 billion USD, and it was all over the world in the news that it was smaller than the full year GDP growth of Belgium, for example. Today, the GDP of Africa is 2.6 thousand billion USD, with the GDP in Belgium remain almost 600 billion USD. That means a 5-time growth, which is still growing, exactly. According to the European Commission's latest forecast, Europe's economy grew less than originally predicted. The EU institution revisited its 2023 GDP growth expectations down to 0.6% in both the 27-member bloc and the Eurozone. That is 0.2 points lower than its previous summer projections, meaning that the EU economy has lost kind of a momentum. But in the meantime, Africa economy remains resilient amidst multiple shocks, like COVID-19 recently, and Africa is definitely the fastest growing continent in the world, with China being #1. Why now is it the ideal time to invest in Africa, the fastest growing continent? It needs to be mentioned that all the excuses we have found to perceive Africa as being atypically risky because of the risk of policy reversal of political uncertainty, nationalization, legal framework, etc., are no longer good excuses for not investing in Africa. Back in 1996, the World Bank stated that during the 90s, some African governments have reformed policies sufficiently that returns of capital in Africa were quite high. Nowadays, almost all the African governments are doing so well that the return of foreign direct investment is now higher in Africa than in other developing areas. Furthermore, the power and the quality of the relation between African governments and international institutions contributed to reduce significantly this risk. Ultimately, within the G20, the whole African Union committed themselves to an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. Africa needs connectors. Missing across much of sub-Saharan Africa are the roads, rails, ports, airports, power grids, and IT backbones needed to lift African economies. This lack of infrastructure hinders the growth of imports, exports, and regional businesses. Companies that can connect Africans and market can prosper. Sub-Saharan Africa is plagued by power outage. Almost 700 hours a year on an average, sapping productivity, adding cost and leaving businesses captive to backup and alternative power options. Massive investment is leading to major upgrades and expansions at Africa port and airports. But much of Africa's growth potentially depends on in-countries and intra-African roads, rails, and air connections. Roads and rail lines are sparse, decrepit, and overburdened. A lack of aviation agreements has limited intra-African air connections. Africa lacks of efficiency storage and distribution infrastructure in those businesses, entrepreneurs, and farmers. Up to 50% of African fruits and vegetables spoil before reaching market. There's a soft infrastructure deficit outside of South Africa. The data and information critical to decision-making by businesses is missing on hard to obtain. Credit and risk informations, market data, consumption pattern, you name it. We've learned a lot from the UAE and Singapore. Those countries told us that once an infrastructure race is on, it can rapidly expand its market. Being the first mover is a significant advantage for investors. Africa trade barriers are failing, and intra-African trade holds enormous potential. With the 54 nations continental free trade area, Africa owns mega trade deal. Even the smallest African economies could see a lift. If duties are lowered and incentives introduced, manufacturers could see benefits from setting up production and assembly operations in multiple African countries. That could lead to development in electronics, machinery, chemicals, textile productions, and processed foods. As a first step, free trade between and within the African economics blocks would make a huge difference. Africa shares a global trade, a meager 3%, can only increase if the continent's commodity and consumption-led economy begin to produce a broad array of goods for homes, markets, and exports. And an increased in local beneficiation in the commodities sector could be a drive of growth. Processing local commodities such as minerals, coffee, cotton, and so on in countries rather than exporting them in raw form. That being said, it will continue to be a challenge for regions with poor power and infrastructures to compete as global manufacturers. Customers are changing. Within the growth of African middle class, we're seeing developments of next expectations. Educated, urban professionals are young, brand aware and sophisticated in terms of their consumption. Retailers and consumers brands want to anticipate and drive buying preferences in fashion, for example, home and lifestyle products, but they know they need international standard supply chain if they are to meet demand. The largest economic forces in Africa are small to medium enterprises working to meet this new demand and competing with global brands. The digital transformation. Africa leads the world in mobile adoptions, which continues to offer the biggest cross-sectoral economic opportunities. Mobile payment networks, pioneer in East Africa, opened the wired global economy to poor and banked cities and rural dwellers. Companies such as Novartis, for example, are using mobile communication to manage their supply chain. Olam has used mobile to reach out to new African suppliers and farmers. These mobile initiatives have achieved huge successes. Africa is diversifying. Africa economies are finally beginning to diversify beyond commodities. Though this is still in the early stage, Africa is seeing a returning diaspora that recognize the potential and opportunities by their own countries. This population supports local economic growth with their skills and talent by acting as first movers, investing back in their communities. At the same time, African countries are beginning to place bets on non-commodities area where they can be competitive, and they are packaging themselves to appeal to a broader set of investors, recognizing that they can no longer count on growing investment from China. Every country now has what are called investment promotion agencies, which act as one-stop shops for investors, assisting with registrations, taxes, and other steps to establish companies locally. Africa can lead in sustainable development. In energy, technology, supply chain design, on other areas, Africa has the ability to look at what works elsewhere than fashion its own answers. It can openly embrace new technologies and ideas with no historical imprint from which to break free. It can develop flexible fuel grids that generates power with a mix of abundant wind, solar, hydro, and bioenergy alongside conventional fuels such as oil and gas, which are also abundant. Nowhere on Earth is there as much unused and poorly used arable land. So look for big agricultural breakthroughs and productivity gain in food production in Africa. Business leaders are hungry for vibrant new markets, and consumers know the reality. Globalization means there are few remaining frontiers. As the development world matures and becomes increasingly difficult to trade in as a result of factors from legislation to terrorism, opportunities for corporate growth are limited. There are too few places where entrepreneurs and businessmen with ideas and appetite for risk can bring values and find long-term growth if they are persistent, creative, and determined. But there's something else they know. Africa is such a place. Thus, if you're planning to expand or start your business, Africa is the place to go, is the place to be as well. You need absolutely very good hands-on mentality, focus on acting, on doing, with a great engagement to address culture and diversity issues while leveraging your static management system. To finish, I would like to end my speech by thanking the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber, which have worked brilliantly for their support to the African continent and encourage you to expand and settle all over Africa, especially in my home country, Côte d'Ivoire. The president of Ghana was here and he forgot to mention Côte d'Ivoire. So I'm doing it. And please remember that consistency builds up friendship and trust. And on this basis, opening your offices all over Africa will open great doors for Austrians moving there, and it will be profitable for Africa as well. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.